in this session. Really hope that you will be engaged. If you can be on video, love it. Great. Would love to see your face. Would love to be able to interact with you in that way. We're going to use the chat a ton, so please be active typers. Come off mute if you want to. I would love to hear your voices. I would love for you to get something out of this session that relates to your work. You know, your specific context, for you to be able to get your answers or your questions answered, rather. Got to give a shout out to the team. We've got all kinds of Thriving Minds folks here. So maybe we could go around quickly. And I will, before we kind of go around, Thriving Minds is this partnership between Rennie Center, Bright, and MASMHC. We came together and we said, we got to do some work. We're gonna help people build comprehensive school mental health systems. So that's what we're here to do today. Team, want to introduce yourselves?
Hi everyone, I'm Paul Hydrodermith from Bright. Sorry, Ellie. Super happy to be with you all. And John, thanks as always for your leadership around this topic and so many other things in our state. Rennie Partners, just also really, really grateful. So, and most of all, grateful to everyone who's joining us today to learn together.
Hey everyone, my name's Ellie Sanchez. I'm an associate with the Rennie Center and a partner here with Thriving Minds folks. Very excited to see all of you here. You will all see my name in your inboxes tomorrow with follow-up information. So stay tuned for that. And I can kick it off to Laura.
Everyone, Laura DeZorni, I'm the Deputy Director at the Rennie Center. I echo everything Ellie just said, except I won't be in your inboxes tomorrow, but I'm glad to be with you all here today. And Courtney, why don't I kick it over to you?
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney. I'm with the Bright program, and it's just exciting to be here and to be a part of this team. And just know that one of the things that we just continue to hope to do is just be attuned. We're excited about how screening can help address mental health. And you are in very capable hands of a fabulous, fabulous man who happens to be an expert in all that he does. And not only is he an expert, he brings the compassion, he brings the grace, and he brings the hope to it that we really wish many other people had. And so I just want to share that.
Courtney, my God, it was really kind. I'm so thrilled to be here today with you. This is one of my favorite topics to present on, for sure. And we got some new content and new resources today to expand upon some of the stuff we've done in the past. You're going to leave here today with a massive amount of resources. We feel like flooding you with support is important. I do want to call out, some of you here are grant recipients through DESE, and you are on the hook to get this up and running by June. And that's a good thing. We're going to get there. And I'm going to give you some resources today that will allow for you to start tomorrow if you want to. Small scale, safe, but tomorrow if need be. The goal is to get you to a point where you feel comfortable with this and to take some of the guesswork out of it, to also give you practical resources. We could theory craft all day long about screening. We're going to do a little of that, and then we're going to get to work. Make sense? With me? Thumbs up? Okay. Here are our partners. We talked about them, and there they are. So, opening activity, share in the chat. I want to get you used to typing away, typing away. What's your position and district or organization? If you could share that in the chat. And then while you're doing that, what do you hope to gain today? I'm going to call that out as you type. Again, we're going to use the chat a ton. Hoping that you'll be engaged. Welcome, Amanda. Awesome. Falmouth. We got Whitman Hanson. We got school adjustment counselors. We've got directors. Love it. Let's get lots and lots of typing in the chat. We should have 45 people typing away. Marshfield, great. Hoping to gain tools to roll out screening smoothly and effectively. Patrick, we got you today. We're gonna do that. Process for identifying and implementing a screener. Certainly gonna make that happen, Sean. That's gonna happen. Gain guidance on next steps to successfully implementing a screening process. We got you there. These are all very practical asks. I appreciate that. Okay. So you can keep typing away. Lindsay offers, hoping to get a better handle on screening for our new LEAs. Great, love it. Keep typing away. I'm gonna start in on this. We've got a lot of content to cover. I'm gonna move fast sometimes. I'll slow it down when I can. We've got about 100 slides to get through. Woo. Buckle up, here we go. This is the definition that we operate from in terms of universal mental health screening. We're using a tool or process employed with an entire population. You don't get to the universal part of universal screening overnight. All right, we want to start slow, manageable, safe, and scale as we learn what we like about the process and what we need to adapt as we bring it to scale. We're identifying strengths and needs. We're also identifying students who are at risk for a mental health or substance use concern. Just want to check in with you around this. Is anyone doing this kind of work right now? Something that meets this definition? What do we think? How about a yes or no in the chat? Typing away, typing away. Molly is, love it. Lauren, good work. Dessa, student strengths but not mental health. Good call, Madeline. So you're on one side of the equation, maybe balancing it out with some of the presenting issue assessments. Barbara's a yes. Everyone's doing craft, right? We got to count that as part of the process. So everyone is actually engaging in some semblance of screening, albeit a very different kind of approach, that clinical interview style approach, which is not necessarily super efficient all the time. Yep, Barbara, expert for sure. Okay, so you understand what we're looking for here. The one thing I got to call out with this definition is that we're looking for identified data. If we're doing like a school climate survey, that's great aggregate data to point at the needs of a population. That is not identifiable data that can point to a kid that needs help. And screening requires that identified data piece. Does that make sense to people? You with me? Okay, good. So why screen? Like we gotta start with some justification here if we want to actually call out this as a practice that's worth pursuing. Let's start with this question. Some of you I've seen in presentations like this before, and I have asked you this question. I would ask that you do not respond. Let the new people respond. According to NIMH data, how long does it take on average for students to get care after they start to experience symptoms of a mental health concern? How long does it take for our kids, once they start to experience a mental health problem, to get the help that they need? What do you think on average nationally? Type it in the chat, come off mute. If you come off mute, you get an extra 100 points. 6 months, says Kelly. Thanks, Kelly. I appreciate you participating. 6 months, 6 months to a year. Thank you, Rachel. Kristen, 6 months to a year. Madeline says 1 year. Okay. 6 to 12 months. Erica, certainly not Pollyanna, 2 years. Fair enough. Anyone else? What would you say if I told you it was 8 to 10 years? Is that shocking to anybody? Love your reactions in the chat. What do you think about that? 8 to 10 years. Holy cow, says Rachel. Agreed. Hurts to hear, terrible, too long, too much struggle. Yeah, agreed. This is what we're up against, friends. Without this practice, we don't get ahead of the problem because we wait for two things. What are those two things that we typically wait for in our mental health system for us to react? What are they? Come off mute. What do you think? Permission. Rachel, you're pointing to a very specific thing, and I think that suicidal ideation would be the thing that Lindsay called out, which is crisis. We wait for crisis, we wait for diagnosis. That's not a very proactive public health model, if you ask me, but that's what we typically do. If we ever want to get to a prevention model, this is an essential piece of that system. We have to look for emerging concerns and provide preventative, proactive services. Does that make sense? Who's with me? Is this an argument you can put on the table for your people? Okay. We are the prevention arm of the mental health system writ large. There is no other institution that is better positioned to engage in universal screening, period. In addition to that, we can provide services and supports before diagnosis and crisis. We just got to own that. That's on us. Help's not on the way. I love me some community-based mental health partners, but you know how long it takes to get kids enrolled in community-based mental health supports. It used to be 6 to 9 months before the pandemic. Now there are no wait lists because they stopped making them because it's of no use. It's fake news. So some justification for why this is important. So these are the major components of our screening system. I want to paint a picture for you of kind of what we've developed over the past 7 or 8 years. This is part of a much larger system of support. We've adopted a comprehensive school mental health system model out of the National Center for School Mental Health. This is really another tiered system of support. So we're talking about social emotional learning, mental health literacy at tier 1. We're talking about group-based services at tier 2, group therapy, individual therapy at tier 3, and wraparound services. We engage in K-12 screening. This is the first year that we're a K-12 screening district. The tough part was getting that K-4 piece underway. We didn't find a tool that we liked or that was feasible to implement, but we did, and I'll talk about that later. We focus primarily on internalizing concerns. Who can guess why? Why do we focus on internalizing concerns? No one's come off mute yet. It's making me sad.
Because
I'm sorry, John, can you tell me what you mean by internalizing concerns? Is that internalizing concerns of the school people and administration or the child's internalizing?
So talking about things like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress.
Thank you.
Yeah, Craig, did you have something?
I was going to say, you know, externalizing concerns because they're blowing up the school.
Yeah, there you go. We're really good at seeing kids flip desks. We're awesome at that. We're really terrible at finding kids who are presenting with anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress. We need a tool to employ to get at that. Our screening measures exclusively rely on student self-report. There's a reason for that. Rate of reliability is a reason. Bias is a reason. Bad science is a reason. There is no better way at getting at how someone feels than asking them. It is bad science to expect that you can guess how a student feels. I'm okay with teacher rating scales if, and only if, we're talking about objectively yes or no answers. There's a question on the SDQ, which is a tool that some of you may be familiar with, and it asks, the student steals things from class. That is either true or it is not true. It's also limited by the observation of the reporter, so it's not perfect, but it's also the case that you either know that information or you don't. I'm okay with a question like that. I'm not okay when we dip our toes into student affect and expect that we're going to get a really good answer. Does that make sense to people? Okay. I want to make sure that we're checking for understanding because we got a lot of stuff that we're going to cover. We do employ passive consent with opt-out procedures. As we scaled up screening, we recognized that that was the thing to do. I'll talk about why later. We do administer our tools using Google tools. We are a Google Enterprise district, so the data is stored on our servers. So we feel good about that. I would not recommend using a Google account that is personal, but we've got the enterprise account, feel good about it. We follow up a student scoring in the moderate to severe range, and any students that indicate self-harm or suicidal ideation get same-day follow-up. Who's following up with these people, with these students? School counselors, school psychologists, adjustment counselors / social workers. We're using our internal staff to respond to the needs of these kids. And then we're using our internal staff to provide the services afterward. That's not to say that we turn a blind eye to partnerships with community-based mental health, but we are building internal capacity to do this work. Jamie, I got to call you out for a moment. I had a meeting with Jamie like an hour ago, and she shared a really wonderful perspective that I feel like put it into perspective for her staff. We can't wait for someone to come help us. We got to do this work. We got to be ready to do this work. So I appreciate that, Jamie. Really resonated with me, and I feel like that's the message that we got to send, that we have to be ready. It's not to say that there's no help out there and that we can't leverage community-based mental health a little bit. We can, but we have to be part of the solution. Okay. So a little bit more about the why. We're identifying kids, we're fostering prevention, we're improving collaborative case management. Screening fosters early identification. Incredibly important. We got to get ahead of problems so we can provide proactive services. I talked about us being the prevention arm of the mental health system. We don't have to wait for crisis and diagnosis. Early identification reduces instances of crisis. If all you're doing is putting out fires, that might be because you didn't get ahead of that crisis to begin with. We recorded a 63% increase in the identification of students who were eligible for services for internalizing concerns after we started screening. That told me something. We had other methods for identifying kids, but without this practice, we were missing a massive swath of students. You can share these data with stakeholders. You just got to get a release. I've had parents that have made the decision that they want to ultimately take that screening data and bring it to their PCP so that we can foster that communication between their doctor and the school. Totally fine to do. We have to also be sensitive to confidentiality, and we are not sharing this information if the limits of our confidentiality have not been hit, or we don't have the permission of the kid. Yes, the kid. Developmentally appropriate, I get it. We have to be sensitive to that, but our first ask of a kid, especially a kid in high school, is, are you okay with me sharing this information? That therapeutic rapport piece is huge. Okay, when we started in on this process of developing screening, we had a ton of questions. We didn't know what tools to employ. We didn't know about consent or staff readiness. Quick show of hands, are these some of the questions that you're grappling with right now? Yes or no in the chat? Pretty much everyone. Okay. We found some answers to this. I think it will be helpful to share what we've learned, knowing that there are lots of different answers to all these questions. So that will be something that we'll unpack over the course of this presentation. I'm recognizing that in a minute, I'm going to have to move the thing that's covering my window because I'm going to be blind by the sun, but we'll wait for that. These are the critical components of universal mental health screening that we're going to cover. These are the essentials, the foundational pieces that we have to be ready to put in place. And there's somewhat of a sequence to this. You got to have a team to start, to operate from, so you can allocate resources, so that you can take the time to engage in this work, so that you can manage the logistics, perhaps get funding. Although I'll share that funding is not necessarily something that you need to tap into to get this practice off the ground. Buy-in, huge. Lots of justification has already been shared about why screening is important, but there's more work to be done that has some local flavor and context to it that will really make the argument work well. PD for your staff, technical assistance. You're literally sitting in a PD session right now, so you're moving toward that target. Selection of a population to screen. You got to figure out a screening measure to use. Consent procedures. Day of planning, data collection, analysis, and warehousing. Where are we putting this stuff? How are we using it? And the coordinated follow-up, the most important piece. I will share now. If you're going to engage in screening and you're not going to actually react to the data, please don't do it. Wildly unethical. These are actionable data. So we have to ultimately respond to the students that are identified. Within this work, there is, I talked about, comprehensive school mental health systems being the model that we have adopted. And I definitely feel like it's worth sharing that it is not the case that, screening is just a standalone thing. It's part of a much larger system. When you screen, you need to refer to services. If those services don't exist, it's a problem. If you don't have a team that is looking at this body of work, problem. If you don't have buy-in and a larger vision for your comprehensive school mental health system, that could pose a problem. Basically, we're talking about another tiered system of support. That's all it is, but it works in conjunction with all those other tiers, all those other flavors of NPSS. Like this plays nice with PBIS. It's certainly inclusive of SEL, trauma responsive practices. And it definitely leverages evidence-based services and supports. That's essential. These are some of the things that we've undertaken around screening. That's part of that larger system. Teaming, resource mapping, needs assessment. Groups that look at family and student needs, MOUs established, lots of professional development. So just know that you can get this off the ground. You probably have some of this stuff already going, but just be aware that as you're building screening, the larger system is going to be built out around it. I feel like if we didn't have a triangle in this presentation, you would have a lot of hurt feelings in the room. You'd be sad. So I always try to make sure that I deliver on the triangle. I would call this a universal practice for sure. It is something that's supposed to be for everyone. It's not going to be for everyone to start, right? You got to start somewhere. You got to start slow. So we'll talk about that in great detail later. And just a reminder, we label interventions, not kids. Kids get tier 2 services or tier 3 services, and they move between tiers of support based on their level of need. We don't want to pigeonhole a kid with a label like you're a tier 2 kid. You need that kind of support. That's not okay. Label interventions. Okay, I want to hit pause for a minute before we get into preparing. What immediate questions do we have about this? How are we doing? Madeline's good. Okay. Lindsay's good. As questions come up, feel free. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. We've done a lot of justifying. We've done a lot of setting the stage for screening. We're going to talk a little bit about the lead up to implementation, and then we're going to talk about the components of screening step by step and get into the weeds with the data and also how to pilot this again, potentially tomorrow. I'm going to briefly mention this as it's a critical piece. We could have a 2-hour discussion about this on its own, but you need a team. It needs to be a multidisciplinary team. You need to have people on the team that can provide resources, that can secure resources and time, that can manage logistics, that can do the work. So in my mind, this is a blend between clinical staff and administrative staff, and that you are working together to get this off the ground. These are the features of a quality school mental health team. This is drawing upon the work of the National Center for School Mental Health. Quick glance at this, and then I'd love to see in the chat, which of these could you check off in your district? Are you a 2 out of 5? Are you 3 out of 5? Do you have a team? Do you have streamlined teams? So you've got an SEL team and a mental health team and a PBIS team, or have you kind of collapsed those together? Do you have a meeting structure? Do you promote data sharing? Do you have good working relationships with outside partners? What do you think? Patrick's offerings 3 of 5. Okay, fair, room to grow. Appreciate that. Mary, same. Molly, 2 of 5. Okay. 2, 1. No worries. We got to do this reflection, right? We have to know what we're missing if we're going to fill in the gaps. 205, 1. So just food for thought. Your team can certainly get to a better place. And if it's in a better place, you're going to do better work and it's going to be more efficient and effective. But without a team, you're not going to be able to ultimately usher this work forward. The most important piece is that you have a team. If it's less efficient, it's unfortunate. If it's maybe not all the way, connected with community-based partnerships, not great, but you can still do the work. So just know that this is an ongoing process to improve the teaming process. When we talk about generating buy-in and support, I think that it's important to have an argument for every one of your stakeholders. You gotta understand how school mental health impacts all the outcomes. Mental health is the magic bullet that mediates academic, behavioral outcomes, post-secondary outcomes. If you invest in mental health, you get all the things. But we need to be ready for the argument with our school committee, with administrators, with our own staff who are maybe fearful of screening. We have to be ready to talk to parents and to kids and to teachers. So have those arguments ready. Know that aligning the process of screening with the other initiatives that you're undertaking in your district is just going to make things go better. So align your goals with other existing initiatives. Let's run through this because I've been talking at you for a little bit, but I'd love to hear from you. If you could come off mute, or if you could type in the chat, or if you could come off mute, I'm just saying, how would you justify screening to a group of families and students who are unfamiliar with this practice? What do you think you would say?
If I can jump in, I'm Pat Healy. I feel like there's been a good amount of fallout just from the pandemic itself. And I think that a lot of community members are kind of like in tune to kind of mental health more than ever. So I think I would probably sell it as a way to address some of the trauma that kids went through the pandemic itself.
I love that, Patrick. Thank you so much. Others, what do you think?
It's Madeline. I think that I like what you said earlier about, and I should have written it down, about being preventative and instead of just reacting to crisis, because I think right now we're constantly acting to crisis every day. And then IEPs, at least in my building, I'm not sure Andrea and Melissa are also on here from Quabog. IEPs, like the student has to have it affecting their academics. So they have to have poor grades because of anything to get an IEP that they're suffering from. So example, my daughter didn't get an IEP, even though she had, she was diagnosed by a psychiatrist and a psychologist for having like severe anxiety and depression and OCD. So I think if we focus on the preventative measure and the supportive measure, instead of just like, okay, we're going to find a bunch of people who have mental health problems, so they're going to need IEPs. That's not going to help the system. It's about getting the resources set up and then being preventative about it so that they are healthier instead of dealing with just crises. So I think I would go with the preventative concept.
I love that, Madeline. And you're actually addressing another one of the questions on the screen, which is, what would you say to a staff member who's concerned that screening means more IEPs? It's the opposite, friends. Like, we're getting ahead of problems such that a kid won't need the level of support that is a tier 3 intervention. We're providing services and supports before crisis and diagnosis. So we've actually, we've got plenty of good info that points that screening actually reduces the number of IEPs. I see Craig in the chat play a game of who would you rather, would you rather have a bunch of problems you don't know anything about, or would you rather know the scope of the problem and not necessarily have the perfect tools to respond, but you have the route to do productive work? I love that. Lindsay says, we have spoken about this much like physical health screening. Many are more comfortable with the idea of mental health and wellness if spoken about from a healing and wellness centered place. I really appreciate that. I love the connection there. That makes a lot of sense. So suffice to say, there are arguments to be put on the table to address these things, but we got to lean into having those arguments ready. So, think of the kinds of questions that you would get pushback on. Why is this important? Why are we investing time in this? Doesn't this mean more work? What are we going to do about all these anxious and depressed students? And then you can counter with, they already exist. They're here. You just now know about them. We can do something about it. So we could probably spend a couple hours just on this slide, talking through the different things that you will ultimately contend with as you try to stand this practice up. But suffice to say, be ready for the justification. Be ready to talk about this in a way that is getting at prevention and reducing instances of crisis. Cool? Okay. This isn't, I've hot linked so much stuff in this presentation. This is a link to, it's a little dated in terms of, the arguments are still fresh, but the document's a little dated. But suffice to say, this is just more on generating that buy-in. You can take a peek at that later. So we've gone from teaming to generating buy-in and now needs assessment. What do you need and what do you have? I think when we're talking about screening, we have to reflect on who are the staff in your building that you can draw upon? Do they have expertise in actually looking at data? Are there tech savvy staff? Are there people who are really excited about the expansion of school mental health practices that you can leverage early? Who are those early adopters? Is there funding that you can tap into? And what resources do you need? Do you need professional development? Do you need actual like tools to use or documents or template language? I'm going to throw so much stuff at you later that you can just take. I hope you will. And what policies and practices do you need to develop? Is there stuff that you need to actually write down in terms of policy that is going to change the way you do things relative to the collection of psychosocial data? So knowing what you have to actually contend with is a piece of this, and having a conversation with your team about that is important. I'll point to the SHAPE system for those of you who are familiar, and for those of you who aren't, please check it out as a great way to assess the readiness of your district to implement screening, and also to get a sense about how comprehensive what is the health of your mental health system in your district. I get this question a lot, so I feel like throwing it in here is important because sometimes I hear like, well, we don't have the resources to make this happen. Can you still pilot screening if you're the only staff member who will provide follow-up services? What do you think? I'd love to see 44 answers in the chat, yes or no. Can you still pilot? Erica's like, nope, I'm not doing it. Maybe from Kelly, okay. Only if you can get to all the needs timely, not sure, okay, no, okay. I'm gonna push back a little bit here. Let's pretend like you are the only person providing follow-up services, but you keep the scale of your implementation of screening small enough that you can manage the fallout. That's doable, right? What if you start with one class? We're going to get about 25 to 30% of students that will screen in. Of those, a percentage will require services. So it's that staff member asking the question, do I have the capacity to pick up 2, 3, 4 students from the screen? Potentially. And if that's the case, you've armed yourself with some data that you can bring back to administration and say, look, I have to stop this pilot of screening because I'm already at capacity. If we want to continue with this, we need more help. You can project out that data from that small test of change and make a really strong argument for more. Make sense? Cool. Yes, there are barriers to implementation, but we have to move through them. We cannot wax poetic over the barriers. We got to do the work. Funding, I'm going to rip through this real quick, because I want to get to some other stuff. This doesn't have to cost anything. I'm going to show you some free measures in a bit. PD, you're sitting in a PD session currently. There's also more PD to come. Readiness to provide follow-up services. You've got some in-house staff, I know you do, and you can leverage community-based partnerships as well. Just screen at the scale that you can respond to effectively. Doesn't mean you can't try this practice out. You can also simply screen students who are already engaged in services, so that if you screen hot, no big deal. Kids already enrolled in services, no big deal. Staffing, yeah, you do need to dedicate time and energy to this, but You are going to make a better argument for more staff if you're showing your local need with data. Time, it's an investment in prevention. And implementation support, tap into Thriving Minds. We're happy to help. This is something that we want to spread. Lauren offers staff willing to team and collaborate on this. Yeah, for sure. You got to get that buy-in going with your team, not just with your external stakeholders, but with your internal staff. Okay. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I feel like it's important to at least mention that we have to reflect on whether or not we're leveraging our staff effectively. Training programs have changed pretty dramatically over the past 20 years. And I think we still have a traditional view of what our staff can and can't do. So please take the time to reflect on whether or not you're leveraging all of your mental health staff effectively. There's another session that we're going to be doing coming up, talking about how we can effectively leverage all school-based mental health staff and not divvy out domains of need or tiers of support, but create a comprehensive model where everyone's pulling in the same direction. If that's of interest to you, please sign up. There are some things that you're going to need to help staff with. The administration and scoring and analysis of the results of these tools, but that's doable. There are resources to support you in doing that. I'm going to point to some of them in a couple minutes. Conducting a clinical interview, I'm going to point to a coordinated follow-up guide that I think will be helpful in a couple minutes. Referring students to appropriate services, I think that's something that if you need to ready up your team around that, fine, but that's great work to undertake anyway. You always need to be ready to refer students to good services internally and externally. So if you haven't done that, then yeah, that's some work to do. And then evidence-based services for identified students. There's a lot of training out there. We're providing some of it. There are others as well, but readying up staff to provide evidence-based therapeutic services is important. We're still in that preparation mode, right? Teaming. Getting into generating buy-in and support, needs assessment, readying up staff. We're still there. Selection of population to screen. Who are we going to point to for our pilot? Kristen offers in the chat, how often would this ideally be conducted? And screening writ large, I'm assuming you're talking about. So I don't know that there's necessarily an ideal. We're undertaking efforts to expand the frequency of our screening in Methuen, because we feel like a one and done point in time screen is not going to capture all the students. So I'll say twice a year would be great, but how about this? If you have never done screening, then once a year is pretty phenomenal. That could be the ideal. Go at the speed that you can get to, Kristen. But I think getting it off the ground to start at least once a year, that's wonderful. So how are we figuring out which population to screen? You might want to look at local, at some data that you have at your fingertips, like who's familiar with YRBS, Youth Risk Behavior Survey? Yep, we got some takers. How about VOCAL? You know what the VOCAL survey is? You all have VOCAL survey data. If you're a public school district, you might not even know about it. It's a school climate survey that is embedded as part of MCAS. You need the research and planning tab in Edwin Analytics or in the DESI portal to be able to actually access those data. So get with your IT director if you have not, if you don't have access to that. But that will help you to identify what population and what's the presenting issue for which you're going to screen. Also, like, what's the intention behind your decision to screen? How does this inform the selection of the population you're going to screen? Are you seeking to evaluate the efficacy of an SEL curriculum, or are you looking for students that have tier 2, tier 3 needs relative to a symptom or to a presenting issue like anxiety or depression? Points of transition might be a good time to screen, 8 to 9 in our district, like screening grades. That should say 4 to 5. It says 5 to 8, and that's really weird. I don't know why. We have to select our populations with equity in mind. It would be wildly inappropriate if the pilot screening cohort did not represent what our district looked like. It has to be the case that we are selecting those who will screen in a manner that is accounting for things like, are we screening in all the languages necessary? Like, do we have tools that can be translated into other languages? If I use this measure, will all students be able to access it? That's a huge question. You have to ask that question at the outset, not when you've brought it to scale. I think it's also important that the cultural backgrounds of the students that you're screening are taken into consideration when you're selecting a tool. And also knowing that the psychosocial instruments that you're going to be selecting from are not perfect. And that the way to get at culturally responsive practice with screening is in the coordinated follow-up, where you are being a culturally responsive clinician in unpacking that screening data. That's really important. Are you on board with me there? Makes sense? Okay. When we first started screening, it was the case that we started really, really small. Rapid cycle micro tests of change. So we were screening one student at a time, couple over here, one measure here, just to get a feel for what screening felt like and to get a sense of what it would ultimately be like as we brought it to scale. This allowed for us to identify areas to improve. We were able to stand up systems that would support screening effectively and build off successes as we brought this to scale. So a lot of ad hoc screening. This question is a big one. What can you learn by screening a single student, one measure, one day? This is the approach that I would recommend you undertake to start. Just because you're screening one kid, it doesn't mean that the data that you gather is small. It's actually massive. You learn a ton by screening one student. You learn about selection of measure, how to administer and score that measure. You learn about consent procedures, where to house that data, interpretation of scores, how you're going to use that data to adjust your practice or to monitor student growth. So it's not that you have to screen 100 kids to get meaningful data about the practice of screening. Screen one kid, reflect on that, and then you can make decisions about what it means to bring it to scale with 5 kids, 10, maybe a class, grade, school, district. We are going to jump into the major tenets of universal mental health screening now. We've talked about ultimately the justification for screening. We've talked about the preparation to get to a point where you're ready to do the work, some light tests of change, and now the major tenets. Before I do that, I want to hit pause and check in with all of you. Love to see 44 answers in the chat. How are we doing? I recognize it's like 4 o'clock midweek. Are you doing okay? Is this making sense? Yes or no in the chat. Okay. We got some affirmations here. We're doing okay. Excellent. It's fast, Kelly. I get it. I get it. You're gonna get these slides. You're gonna be able to reflect on this. There's a lot to cover, and I want to make sure we cover it all so that you can be readied up for this. But I'm glad you're all doing okay. All right, let's keep going. This is probably one of the biggest questions that I get when we're talking about screening. What am I actually going to use? I have no idea what screening measures are out there. What can I use? I don't have any money. I don't know whether or not this tool is a good one or not. Will this match my population's needs? So let's talk about that a little bit. There's a difference between pro-social competency-based measures and symptom-specific measures. Depending on what you are, like the reason for your screening, that is going to dictate what you ultimately select. How you want to use the data is going to drive what you select. So if you're wanting to maybe determine the impact of curriculum, SEL curriculum, yeah, you might want to look at an SEL-based measure, like something that's lined up with the CASEL competencies. If you want to look for internalizing concerns so that you can improve your proactive identification of kids, well, then you're going to want to look at a symptom-specific tool. And if you want to understand maybe different data sets moving over time, multiple measures of growth, especially when we're talking about progress monitoring, will will be really important. So like I often give the example of like depressive symptoms decreasing over time while we see behavioral activation increase. That's a pretty great data or multiple data sets that will point at the efficacy of the practices you're using. Okay, we're going to do a little interactive thing here. Can you still see my screen, Shape System? Okay. For those of you that don't know what the Shape System is, this is a web-based needs assessment and resource mapping tool that really measures the health of your mental health system. I mentioned that before. There is a lot more to the Shape System than the screening and assessment library, but I'm going to cover that today. So when I'm asked the question, well, I don't know how to figure out what to use for a measure, this is a place to go. So follow along with me here. If you're not looking at the screen because you've passed out, then please open your eyes briefly to check this out. Let's pretend like I need a measure of anxiety, and it needs to be for screening. The kid is 12 years old. It needs to be in Spanish. Student's going to fill it out. It needs to be free. Well, there you go. Free measures for you to use. Ready to go. It's that easy. Let's jump into this one. You're going to get a data sheet on every one of these tools. It's going to give you information on the languages that the tool is offered in, access to the measure, scoring and interpretation information down here, benchmarks, important information to consider when you're selecting this tool, how to administer it. Is this something that is useful? Do we like this? Did you know about this? Who here did not know about the screening and assessment library and is now going to use it all the time? Nice, Madeline. Lexi didn't know about this. Patrick, nice. Kelly, appreciate it. Erin, good, good, good. It's free. All this is free. Grab yourself an account, get in there, start selecting tools. And again, lots of different measures in here. The title of the URL, I'm going to pop it in here. It's, hold on. There you go. theshapesystem.com. So while you're all excited about the Shape System, I'd like to go into this activity, which means you have to be engaged. I just dropped in the chat the PHQ-9. I would love for you to open that up, and we're going to run through a list of questions. We're going to do a screening measure scavenger hunt. I want you to start to get a feel for how easy it is to get information from these info sheets on these measures. So pull that up, and then I'd love for you to answer relative to the PHQ-9. Type in the chat as soon as you have an answer. How much is this measure? How much does it cost? It's free. Yeah, Lindsay, you got it. This is a free measure. What is the age range that this measure is normed for? And I'm talking about the PHQ-9 item for students. Age range 11 to 17, is that right? There you go. Easy, very easy. What's the score range for moderate depression? What do you got? Check the second page, friends. It's there. 10 to 14, Madeline on the board. Well done. And what does a score of 1 or more on question 9 require? Question 9. What do you think? If they're endorsing question 9, what are you doing? Don't overthink it. Yep, Maria, suicidal ideation. So, risk screening. There you go, Craig. Well played. So, we just ran through a measure that is a reliable, valid, free measure, super easy to use. You were able to answer 4 questions in about a minute that are really relevant to selection of measure. Imagine that your team underwent the same process. Super easy. Allows for you to, this is PD for your team, right? just print out a bunch of these info sheets and say, let's talk about them. Let's actually mess around with them. Let's take them ourselves in a fake way, right? Like you don't want to do a coordinated follow-up on your counseling team, but get used to using them. Does this make sense? Pretty straightforward, pretty easy, yeah? I did promise a prize for people that answered. The prize is that you get all kinds of resources later. Why are we using a problem-specific measure in Methuen? Oh, Patrick's got a question. Silly question, but if a student scores high concerning, besides providing resources, in-house support, do we also inform the guardians of that student? Patrick, I love this question. That is an excellent question. I'm going to say not necessarily. The limits of confidentiality are what? What do we got? Danger to self or others, abuse, neglect. That's what we're on the hook for. Student comes to your office outside of screening, shares that they're not feeling so hot. They've been depressed a little bit. You say, I'd love to offer you support. Is that something you're interested in? I don't know. You want me to loop in your family? You know, are they aware? I don't want you to, but I appreciate that. Are we breaching confidentiality there? No. Danger to self or others? Nope. Abuse, neglect? No. Now, developmentally, we are going to have to be sensitive to the difference between a kindergartner and a high schooler, but those limits of confidentiality are there nonetheless. So, long answer, Patrick, but I think we're informing parents if danger to self or others is indicated, if abuse, neglect is indicated, or if the kid wants services. We have to get consent because they're minors. Fair? Okay. I love that question. Thank you for the question, Patrick. We're using problem-specific measures because ultimately we want a rich data set that is super actionable. And we feel like pulling together a bunch of different measures that paints a picture of the internalizing needs of kids is going to allow for us to be really effective. I see some screening tools out there. I don't want to knock them, but sometimes the outcome of the screener is Heather is at risk, to which I say, at risk for what? We have to be able to get a little more specific, because if that's the only outcome that I get from introducing a screening tool into my community, I'm gonna have to do a secondary screen anyway and get at whether or not Heather's at risk for anxiety or depression or post-traumatic stress or anything else. So the specificity of these measures, I think, is a benefit. And when you, again, pull them together, I think that's a really meaningful way to get a comprehensive view of the needs of kids. Also, I didn't mention this before, but like when we're selecting measures, I think sometimes people are like, well, we've got to do this massive, like district-wide survey of the needs of our kids. Let's really dig in. And I did it too. We did a counseling log analysis for 2 years. Guess what it told us? Our kids were anxious and depressed. I could throw darts at a map and be fairly certain that anxiety and depression are problems in that district. So please don't take a massive amount of time to land on a measure. We know what our kids are dealing with right now. Anxiety, depression, trauma. Madeline offers a good point. When I receive the DESA data from our schools, it just tells me how many students are at risk. Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat helpful, but you got to do work beyond that to get at what that risk actually says, what it's pointed at. Thanks, Madeline, good point. These are a couple measures that you can tap into. You just saw the PHQ-9, I showed you the GAD-7. These are easy to use. Who here is feeling like they can add 7 numbers together accurately? Great, wonderful. These are not difficult to score at all. Super easy. This is important before you start to dispatch your team to respond to these data. You have to determine which cut scores and decision rules you're going to make around these data. Prior to screening, what score ranges am I going to respond to with the coordinated follow-up? Really critical question. I'm going to recommend moderate to severe. What are the specific questions that we have to orient to as a team? You just saw the PHQ-9. Question 9, that's a separate follow-up. That's same day follow-up. So you've got a 2-window screening follow-up. Anyone who endorses question 9 and anyone else who scores in the moderate to severe range. Got to have those discussions before you screen. What about the indicators for referring students to services? Should you refer every kid who scores in the moderate to severe range for services? What do you think? Yeah, no? Who's got an answer? Nope, says Craig. Why? Craig, come off mute, buddy.
I'd say our mission is, preventative, but it's also school-based. So it depends exactly how much it's impacting their ability to attend and participate in school.
Do you think that the data is always perfectly accurate? Never base intervention solely on screening. It's an indication of need. You got to scrub out that data and actually validate whether or not it's a true concern. Yeah, we require a follow-up, Lindsay, but not a definite referral. We gotta ask questions of that data, and that requires being in front of the kid. Also, this is critical. Policies and procedures for responding to critical incidents. Having that established prior to screening, like who's doing suicide risk assessments in your district? Do you have procedures for filing a 51A? Do you have procedures for referring students for evaluation? All really essential. Madeline asks, are students answering these questions in a group, on the computer, or alone with a staff member? Both and, could be anything, right? To start, it could be in the counseling office, one student at a time. It could be a student maybe in an advisory who's filling this out on a computer. The scale of your implementation is going to dictate what that looks like. In your early phases, I'm going to guess that it's going to look more like a kid in an office in front of a staff member. As you bring it to scale and you have 25 kids, 50 kids, now you're looking for a place where screening can land and that you can draw upon: advisory, health class, whatever it happens to be. Stay in place screen for the entire population, could be. Let's talk about consent. Really, we've got two options. We've got active consent, we've got passive consent with opt-out. Active consent, can I do the thing? Passive consent, I'm gonna do the thing, tell me not to. We have adopted passive consent with opt-out procedures. There's a reason for that. We want to send a message that ultimately screening is just as important as all the other things for which we use passive consent: vision, hearing, dental, mental health on the same page. It's also the case that we recognize as we brought this to scale that it was definitely not going to be possible to engage in universal screening and secure active consent. As we talk about this, though, I always get the question, what percentage of families opted out of screening? Let's take a guess. Type in the chat, how many families opted out? What percentage of families opted out of screening in Methuen during that first year? What do you think? 5%, 1%, 5%, 10%, 5 to 10. Okay. Awesome. 25, Melissa, my God. Less than 1%. This is not something that parents were opting out of. Now, it may be that they were so ambivalent about it that they just didn't take the time to fill out the opt-out form, and that's fine. I'll tap into that phenomenon. I have no problem with that. When we ultimately force their hand in making a decision, if they don't feel really strongly about it, they're not opting out, and that's okay. That means more kids are screened. This is our passive consent message. We send this out a couple times a year. This is an adapted version of this, is read to kids in real time as well. You don't need to feverishly write this down. You're going to get these slides. I'd ask for you, please steal this. Totally fine with me. It works. It's gone well. We're sending a message that we care about kids, and we want for you to ultimately care about your kids too. We also post on our webpage all of the measures that we use so parents can take a peek at those if they want. And we have opt-out procedures on the webpage that we point people to from this message. I'm not going to read through the next 2 slides. Molly asks, do you send this again for second or third screening of the year? We send it out periodically. We don't send it out along with the screening window, if that makes sense. Like we send it out at the beginning of the year and then we send it out at the midpoint of the year, but it is not like explicitly attached to a screening window. We do read that opt-out message at every screening window to the kids. Like I said, I'm not going to read these 2 slides to you, but when we're talking about preparing students and families for screening, these are some talking points. These are some things that I think you need to explain and that you need to provide to families, and you need to assure families that that these data are protected, that they can feel reasonably safe about engaging in this. So I'll leave you to review these after, but the thing that I'd like to review with you is this. Again, something like steal it, by all means. This is the screening FAQ that we developed for our high school that ultimately is now just district-wide. Take a peek at this, and I'd love to hear your reaction to this resource. Is this something that you could ultimately use to prepare students for screening, to help them to understand the why of screening? What do we think? Just so people can get a peek at this, if you don't have it pulled up. These questions came out of work we did with our Mental Health Parent Student Advisory Council. So we really wanted to respond to their questions and capture them in a way that everyone could benefit from their inquiry. What do we think? Useful? Something you can steal? Patrick's got a thumbs up. Rachel's good. We want to just demystify what screening is all about. We want to provide info at the front end so that we can get people to buy into the idea of screening. When they know that they don't have to take the service, that they can say no to discussing the results, that they have some autonomy really in terms of what they do following screening, then it lowers the temperature quite a bit around this process. I would be terrified too if I was a kid and it was like, we're gonna screen now and someone's gonna talk to you and you have to answer and you've gotta get the service and you're gonna be pulled out of class. Like, that'd be miserable. So we wanna just be upfront with people about what it looks like and how they can ultimately engage in this process and feel safe about it. So a resource for you to steal, please do. It's great. As we conducted our universal or really our small tests of change with screening, really at the micro level, 1-2 students at a time, we recognized that we wanted to bring this to scale. I'm going to talk about PDSA cycles in a little while, but what I want to talk about first is this idea of bringing this practice through and scaling it up to make it sustainable. And as we made this practice sustainable, as we brought it to scale, our practice changed. We engaged in use of digital screening with Google Forms. It was no longer paper pencil. Parent notification opt-out process was established in advance of the screenings, and we leveraged our, actually this is probably, I'll show you another slide in a minute that will paint a better picture of this, but suffice to say, it really, like over time, our practice changed. As we brought it to scale, we recognized that the way we used to do things with 1 or 2 kids was not going to work with a class or a grade level. This is a good example. You can hand score the GAD-7 with 1 kid. Who cares? You're adding 7 numbers together. Well, what if it's 2,000 kids? Like, it's just a lot of time. So using auto scoring in Google Sheets and just creating a situation where it's easy to get at the kids who screened in very quickly and efficiently. Yeah, that's a practice that we had to adapt as we went through the process of bringing this to scale. And this is really what I wanted to show you, the evolution of our practice over time. When we start with 1 or 2 kids, yeah, active consent, no big deal. We bring it to scale, passive consent and opt-out. Paper and pencil, no problem with 1 or 2. Web-based screening is necessary when we've got a giant population. And then single student or small group, scaling up to grade level or school-wide. Initially, we were, I think it was Madeline, I think you brought this up, but, administration facilitated by school mental health staff, maybe in the counseling office, and then recognizing that we need to leverage the entire staff to be able to make this really effective. So dropping this into our advisory course or our tech courses or health, so we can leverage the whole staff. And the mental health staff are waiting in the wings, receiving the data in real time. So we're going to talk about the coordinated follow-up. This is the most important part of the process. Again, please don't screen if you're only going to collect data. You have to respond to the data. This is a piece of a inquiry-based implementation guide that I'm going to share with you later. Ultimately, you have to plan for this data, this coordinated follow-up following every single instance of screening. It needs to be attached immediately after the screening window. I've got a question in chat. We have an adjustment counselor that only uses pencil and paper for everything because believes that computers are not secure, confidential. What can we say to that if we use Google Forms? If you're a Google Enterprise District, you're good to go. It is data secured on your server. A lot of times I'll have people be like, wow, John, really inappropriate that you're storing student data in Google, and then I'll ask them where they store their IEPs, and then they kind of skulk away. So it's okay to use these web-based platforms if you have a business level agreement with the company, which is what a Google Enterprise account ultimately is. So it's totally appropriate, Madeline. We've used this for years and years, and there's no data breach that has happened. Within 20 minutes of administering this tool through, for example, advisory, we are ready to go to coordinated follow-up. That used to be a huge barrier. I used to hear like, we can't screen. It takes hours and hours, days to score all these things, but we're good to go, and we're calling kids down within 20 minutes. We have developed that follow-up procedural guide. I'll share that with you in a little bit. The goal of the follow-up is to ultimately get at whether or not this is a real problem for the student and whether or not they want help. That's the goal. Having dialogue with the student around the screening results and getting to a point where we can maybe offer services, make some decisions around next steps for care, potentially contacting parents. To Patrick's point, it's not a categorical imperative. It's a maybe. If a kid wants services, we are going to be reaching out. There you go, Craig. Yep. Google for Education signs an agreement saying the core service is guaranteed for compliance. Absolutely. Patrick, it is age dependent. I think we need to be careful about what constitutes danger to self or others with a 5-year-old compared to a 12th grader. So use your good clinical judgment, seek supervision, make sure that you're talking to your colleagues about your decision to breach confidentiality. Let's keep going. In terms of the coordinated follow-up, 100% of kids are going to get follow-up within 7 days. That is the gold standard. 24-hour follow-up for any students indicating self-harm or suicidal ideation. And by that, I mean same-day follow-up, right? We're getting to those kids immediately, which means screening in the morning is critical if you're using a tool that is requiring same-day follow-up. If you've got the PHQ-9 going, that's not an end-of-the-day tool to use. GAD-7, okay, that's fine, but like give yourself some runway. That's important. We did put crisis teams on call because we didn't know what we were up against. We didn't know how many kids were going to screen in. We didn't ultimately need them, but that was a nice warm blanket. Felt good to know that we had other people that we could refer students to if we needed to. In terms of the follow-up interview, these are some sample questions. This isn't an exhaustive list of questions that you can ask, but you got to ask questions to get to ultimately whether or not this constitutes a situation where we need to make a referral. How long has this been a problem for you? In what ways does this impact your daily life? How have you managed this in the past? What does your support network look like? Going through these questions, some students are like, man, I'm having a bad day, but typically I'm good. I'm like a happy person, and like I've got a great support network. I just failed my chemistry exam. I'm gonna figure it out. I'm fine. Great, no, that's wonderful. If you ever need help, you can come down and get it. We're setting that student up for success later on if they actually do need help. And then you get students for whom it's, yeah, I felt this way for a long time. I don't know how to get help. I'm just kind of at my wit's end. I'm ready to talk about this. I'm ready to get help. Okay. The reality is that you're going to have both, and you're going to have kids that rip down the right side of the screening tool and say, oh, I didn't think you were going to like call me down. Like I didn't think it was a real thing. And that's okay too, because that's an opportunity for you to talk to a kid about, well, we do care and we do respond to these problems, and just make sure others know that, because this is important to us. This is, again, not an exhaustive list, but in the coordinated follow-up guide, there are a few more questions. Does this make sense in terms of why we do this? Let me get lots of thumbs up or yeses in the chat. Are you still with me? Did you fall asleep yet? We have 45 minutes together, friends. Lexi's here. Okay. Elizabeth's here. I need to see more yeses before I go on, please. My God, are you still here with me? Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Paul fell asleep. He's awake now. What a punk. I love Paul. Okay, let's take a look at this. This is the sample coordinated follow-up procedural guide. Again, this isn't perfect. It's something. This guide is designed to help staff orient to the next steps in the screening process. This particular coordinated follow-up guide is orienting to ARCADS, the brief trauma screen, and the social strengths and difficulties questionnaire. This first part, so I'm gonna highlight all the way down to like here. That is measure specific data. So if you're using the PHQ-9, that section needs to be rewritten. But this is an example for you that you can steal. It's gonna run through kind of which ranges do you need to be sensitive to in terms of follow-up. This is pretty important. For the ARCADS, they have two options for gender, boy and girl. Not okay. We have dropped in a non-binary gender marker answer because that is the right thing to do, and the ARCADS needs to be updated to keep with what our students, how our students identify. Our workaround for that is that we have taken the lower threshold for the scores and provided for you the raw scores that you need to be sensitive to. If a student indicates non-binary, it's not going to auto score for you, so you're going to have to take this extra step. But that being said, that's the right thing to do. So, so this is the kind of detail that you have to get into. Or you can not use the ARCADS, and you can use PHQ-9, which is not gender specific, and the GAD-7. But if you like the ARCADS, which is a good tool, it's a quality tool, but that is one piece of the ARCADS that I really dislike. It needs to be updated such that non-binary is a gender marker that's auto-scored. So what does coordinated follow-up look like? We're really spelling out for staff what this needs to, like, what's their purpose here? What are we doing? Why are we meeting with these kids? What specific questions can we ask? How are we readying them up for understanding what services are available? Critical. Procedures for securing consent. We're talking about what services are available. So this, again, like, this is something that lowers the temperature for staff around what that response looks like. They're going to go into this like, I don't know what to ask. They do. You just got to remind them. They're not going to, they're going to come to you with a lot of questions, a lot of I don't knows. Anything that you can put in front of them that is going to lower the temperature and help them to understand what that looks like is going to be of great benefit to them. The reality is that they engage in coordinated follow-up every single day when they have a kid referred to them. They're trying to ultimately suss out, what does this kid need? Why are they down here? Do they need help? That's really what this is all about. So it's just a way to do that in a structured and formal manner. So, because we have a ton of slides left, I'm not going to go through the process of asking all these questions, but I will ask one question. Quick thumbs up, yes in the chat. Does this guide make sense? Does it make sense to put in front of your people resources that they can draw upon to take the guesswork out of coordinated follow-up? Okay, good. Let's keep going there. You can draw upon your community partners as well. You know, I have nothing but good things to say about our community partners. I just know that I can't rely on them all the time. We got to build our internal capacity. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to meet the needs of our kids. Community-based mental health is part of the solution, not the solution. I'll offer this to you. It's a formal agreement, an MOU that we drafted that helps to guide our partnership with our community-based mental health partners. What do we offer? Time, space, referrals. What do we ask for? Consult and collaboration with our in-house staff, use evidence-based practices, and share data with us. That's really the be-all end-all in terms of like what this agreement's about. We got 15% increase in available mental health staff overnight for free just by engaging in this process of asking people to come into our building and provide support. I am going to breeze through this section because it is incredibly critical, no pun intended, but it is also something that I think you can review later. You just need to be ready with critical incident management procedures and resources. Here's some. I got this line from Paul, actually. I was on a hike in Billerica when Paul and I were on the phone, and he was like, I love this idea of directionless pressure when we're talking about what staff are feeling relative to crisis. Like, they don't know what to do. We have to reduce that directionless pressure by giving them the ways in which they can navigate the world around them when they're in crisis mode. So kudos to Paul for this awesome quote. Ease that stress and tension through policy development. These are some crisis protocols for mental health staff, crisis protocols for all staff. We need both, right? Because your school counselors, school psychs are going to respond to a crisis differently than a teacher. Oh, come on, Paul, give yourself some credit. Suicide risk assessment. I want to ask a couple questions on the slide. Who in your district, and if you haven't asked these questions, I would say super important to start, but who conducts suicide risk assessment in your district? Is this something that you've oriented to? School adjustment counselor, okay. In my district, it's school counselors and school adjustment counselors and school psychs. We are asking everyone to do the same thing. Cool. Okay. So some people have identified the person. Thanks, Jamie. Do you have written procedures for this stuff? Have you written down what a suicide risk assessment looks like and have documentation procedures? Yes, maybe. Lauren does. Cool. SAC, no protocols in place. Okay. Craig's using the Columbia. Well played, Craig. Love it. Awesome. I'm going to leave you with this. These are questions to ask of your team. When you get your team together and you're starting to plan for screening, if you don't have an affirmative answer for any of these things, then it's worth chasing down or developing something that will meet those needs. How are decisions made regarding follow-up care? Who's making those decisions? Are we leveraging our mental health staff to make those decisions? Or are we ultimately passing it to a non-clinical staff member and hoping that they make the right decision? We got to draw upon our expertise. Oh, thank you for that, Jamie. Solid for the high school, but developing it for a district. Good. Excellent. Going to breeze through this. Suicide risk assessment used for K4. That's a good call. I'm offhand, I'm not 100% on what the Columbia, like what the norming is. I think it's pretty broad, but might want to take a look at that. The ASQ is a 4-question screening protocol. Tap into that. I like it. It's good. It's simple. Brief screen for adolescent depression, the BSAD. This is in the Science of Suicide curriculum. This is what they use. I like this one. This is the one I like the most. Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. One of the reasons I like this the most is this has been designed such that any human being can administer this. Thanks, Craig. Columbia goes down to K. Most research is 5th grade and up. I knew you'd be on the case, Craig. Thank you. This is a wonderful tool. It helps to guide decision making. It's easy to use. And like I said, they designed it so that a teacher who is caring about kids can ask these questions, a coach, a community member. At the end of the day, they're demystifying the process of getting students in front of a caring adult and asking questions about suicide. They're saying everyone should ask questions about suicide if you're concerned about a person. They have it for kids too, for peers. And it's not to say that we're saying, hey, like English teacher, we want you to now do the coordinated follow-up with this kid and we want you to refer for services, but it provides a structured set of questions that guides decision-making for any human being such that you can get someone in front of help if it's indicated. So it's that warm handoff piece. And it's making it such that suicide prevention is all of our work collectively. So take a look at that. This is the STARS toolkit. Northeast Massachusetts Law Enforcement Council's put this together. This is great for critical incident management. It's linked in here. I'll let you take a look at that. I'm going to skip that. This is all kinds of crisis response stuff. Let's get into this. So I need active participation from our friends in the audience for this one. I'm dropping a measure in the chat. This is the PHQ-9. We're going to do a live demo of screening. We're going to pretend like you are students in grade 10 at the Paul Hyrie-Dermott Regional School District, and you are ultimately in advisory right now. I'm reading the passive consent message with opt-out procedures, and you are deciding to engage in this process of screening. I'd like for you to actually consider what it means to take this measure, to actually fill it out as a kid. And I'm going to show you how to ready up these data so that you can get it to your team in under the 20-minute mark. Fake answers only, please, friends. I am not coming to your house tonight to administer the Columbia. Are we in there? We're filling it out. Give me some affirmative nods. Yes, good, merit, excellent, thank you. So here's the data sheet. Lee, I'm gonna answer your question after this activity, if that's cool with you. Okay, here we go. Data's rolling in. Melissa, Jane, appreciate that. Oh, it's Jane Doe, that's funny. I see what you did there. Let's get a few more responses in here, friends. There you go, rolling in real time. Love this. Apparently you're all on my caseload. So you can imagine a group full of counselors sitting in a conference room watching these data roll in, you know, starting to get to a point where they're like, wow, like look at all these kids. We got to ready up this data. We have to make it accessible to them. I've made this sheet like hard to look at and difficult to manipulate because I want to show you the whole process. You can set yourself up for success by making the sheet a little bit easier to use, but I wanted it to be like, I want to show you the full set of how easy it is to get this, even if I've put a couple stumbling blocks in here, okay? So let's start to ready up these data. First thing, this is all narrative report data. I need numbers, I need quantitative data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say, find the not at all scores and replace it with 0. And then I'm going to find several days. Then I'm going to replace that with 1. More than half the days, that's going to be 2. And nearly every day, that's going to be a 3. Okay, nice. I've got nice, pretty quantitative data. This last line just came in after I was messing with it, so just ignore that one. But let's make it even easier, and I'm gonna pull this out just because it's gonna mess with stuff. Okay. So now I have all kinds of quantitative data, but like I want to auto score this. I don't want people to have to like add stuff up. So I'm going to drop a formula in here. I'm just going to say equals sum. And what am I going to put in here? Where does my data live? G2 to O2. G2, O2. Bam. Simple formula. There is a video at the end of this that shows you step by step how to do this. I'm gonna do it fast, okay? You've got the formula sitting in this cell now. Just drag it down. Done. Everything's scored. You see that? Does that make sense? I'm going fast, but conceptually, it makes sense? Okay. No problem, Shannon. We got to go a step further. This isn't good enough. Your team's not going to be as happy as they could be. Let's throw a filter in here. Craig's looking at this and he's like, yeah, man, I know how to do this, buddy. I know you do, Craig. This is for people who aren't super users in Google, all right? Let's sort it by Z to A. I know the cut scores are right there. I'm going to highlight that for our team. I'm going to highlight that for our team. Oops. These are moderate and severe, respectively, okay? We got one more step though. What happens when students endorse question 9? Immediate follow-up. So I'm gonna actually highlight this special. Who notices something right away? Who would not have gotten follow-up if we only responded to moderate and severe? These friends right here. Despite the fact that they endorsed the suicide question. That's why we have to be sensitive to not just the total score, but the specific questions within the measure. This data is good to go. Does that make sense to people? That took what, 5 minutes? Not even. We've got data that's clean, quantitative, filterable, ready for response. It's that easy. You're going to leave here today with tools that look like this that you can steal and just implement. I've got a video for you to show you how to match up the score sheet and the actual Google form, and then another video that shows you how to score this stuff. Cool. What's your feeling about this experience? How did that go for you? And how does this feel to actually be part of a screening administration in real time? Barbara, thank you, super helpful. Can the formula be set up in advance? Yeah, you can do that, Madeline. It's pretty easy. Awesome. Feel optimistic, cool. Lee Ellen, I don't want to forget your question. How would you respond if clinical staff in a school felt that they could not ethically have teachers engage in screenings, especially SI? Also, can you clarify who you are including as clinical staff? Is this also school counselors? Yep, I am including school counselors as clinical staff because the training that they go through makes them master's level clinicians for sure. I'm not asking for teachers to engage in the screening. They point at the link and they read the opt-out message. They don't see the data at all, ever. So it's just the mental health staff that see the data. I hope that helps, Lee Ellen. Yeah, Jamie, it's user-friendly, right? Start small. Can this be a PD opportunity? I think so, right? Like sit your staff in a room, have them take the tool, train them up on use of this, easy. All right, let's get back. I want to make sure we get through everything. We're going to talk about scaling up screening. We're about 28 minutes left, which is, we're on track. We're going to get through, we're going to make it. I recognize it's 5 o'clock. I know that. Get through the next 27 minutes with me and you're going to get some pretty awesome resources as an e-gift basket for making it through the experience. We started to test our practices on a large scale back in 15, 16. We used the GAD7, the PHQ9, and our CADS 47, which is a mixed internalizing screen. We did 2 large-scale screenings at the high school and started piloting that mixed internalizing screener at the grammar schools. These are the data from our first large-scale screening administration, about 22% of students in the moderate to severe range. This response rate of 45% was beautiful to me. That I thought we were going to get like 5 to 10% of students engaging in the process. We got a lot more than that. So I'll take that all day long. That response rate has only grown over time because we are destigmatizing the idea of engaging in screening and talking about mental health. About the same for depression, about 22% of students. Think of the impact of using these data to advocate for more staff, to advocate for more services, to paint a local picture of the needs of your kids. Really, really critical. I know we have national data that we can point to, but everyone is very quick to say, that's not us. I doubt it. Probably, you know, it's not like that in our district. And then to show them, no, these are kids at Methuen High School. These are your kids. That's what they're saying. Responding to that becomes real. In the following year, we added the strengths and difficulties questionnaire. It's a global scale. It's got a pro-social subscale that I liked. It was another way of kind of looking at the needs of kids. So at this point, we're in like kind of innovation mode. We're trying out new measures. We're scaling them up. We're trying this tool, not that tool. Really just kind of like continuing to flesh out the process of screening. We had, we piloted screening in grades 3 and 4 with the SDQ using a multi-gated approach. So basically it's like pick 5 students in your class that you're concerned about, and then complete the SDQ on behalf of them, the teacher rating scale. We're actually doing away with that. And we're using close gap, which is a measure that is really developmentally appropriate, and student self-report. I'll talk about that a little bit later. We also scaled up RCADs to 5 through 8. So you can see the process, right? Handful of kids in the beginning, 1 student, 1 measure, 1 day, leading to a grade level, couple grade levels, messing around with screening at the grammar schools, piloting it, growing over time, adjusting our practice. These are some data that I think are really important to reflect on, because it is not the case that mental health concerns are solely in the realm of high school. Talking about 13.36% of students on average in grades 5 through 8 in the moderate to severe range on a measure of internalizing concerns, so depression, anxiety. It's a lot of kids. And if we don't head that off with services, we're going to see that number march on up to 22%, and nowadays 38%. This is what we screen for in Methuen now. It's an awful lot. It's only one of the practices that we use to identify mental health concerns, but without this, we are in a reactive stance with internalizing concerns. So we've got closed gap for our youngest students. We've got the CELIS program, which is really looking at social emotional competence for students in 3 through 12. And then mixed internalizing, anxiety and depression and trauma screen. We do screen using SBIRT in 7 and 9 as well. I shared this figure earlier. I don't have to go over it again, but suffice to say, without screening, we were missing a ton of kids. Patrick asks, do you ever pull in law enforcement if crimes are reported? Hasn't really come up, Patrick. You know, for the most part, we're orienting to needs. Let's pretend like a crime was reported that might force us to consider like, ooh, there's some neglect that happened, or, you know, we might be pulling in DCF if there's a situation that comes up, like we would with any conversation we have with a kid. Sexual engagement in early age indicating molestation. Yeah, it's a really important, I mean, at that point, right, you're talking about abuse neglect. And in that case, yeah, we're filing for sure. Good question, Patrick. I want to highlight the importance of screening for Tier 2. One of the most difficult pieces of standing up group therapy is having a critical mass of students at the same time. We have married our group therapy referral window to our screening window, which means that Immediately following screening, we're asking our mental health staff to make referrals to our group therapy program so that we have a ready-made group of kids that we can field into multiple different types of groups. Without that, it's like, Amanda might have a kid and Merritt has a kid. And then maybe next week Lauren does, but then we go back to the Amanda and Amanda's like, no, I enrolled my kid in a different service. And it's just tough to pin down that critical mass of kids. So really essential. What time of day does that group meet? Who runs it? Runs throughout the day. We waterfall through the schedule typically so that we're not hitting the same class at the same time every week. School counselors, adjustments, social workers, and school psychs run it in our district. During the pandemic, about 61% of screened students at Methuen High School are scoring in the moderate severe range for either depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress. About 42% of students scored in the severe range for any one of those measures. This is the kicker though, 17% across the board severe, all three measures. So the importance of this practice was evident before the pandemic. Now it is essential. These are data from last year. We did do remote screening, about 37.7% moderate to severe post-traumatic stress, 34 depression, 34 anxiety. Let's skip that. Our strategic plan includes expansion of screening. I mentioned our K4 screening using close gap. Our stance is that if we can get to kids early, if we can ultimately orient to their needs early, that is a prevention act. And this is the kind of theory of change that we're hoping for. I'll throw out there that sometimes people ask the question, or I guess sometimes the question is posed, what happens if kids don't like take you up on services? Like, what then? What's the purpose of screening? Screening is an intervention unto itself. You're providing students with the opportunity to talk about a problem for which they're now ready to talk about. Great. We're readying them up for services down the line, which is essential. They now know who to go to, and we're destigmatizing the idea of mental health services. So I would count it as a service unto itself. It might translate to services over time. The goal of screening is not to have 100% of kids screened. The goal of screening is to provide an opportunity to kids who are ready to talk about a problem that they have that very opportunity. That's all. You're never going to get 100% of kids to participate. That's okay. Let's provide the opportunity for those that are ready. Craig offers, how did you manage the chicken or egg problem? Meaning if you don't have the tiered services because you don't have the data or means to sort students. So I think what you mean here, Craig, is like, I think you can get around that by scaling screening at the right pace. You can have your cake and eat it too. You can start the process of screening and project out those data from the manageable size of students that you screen to show administration that this is a problem of this magnitude based on the initial data that we have.
I think the problem that we hit was our counselors, our school mental health staff are saying, no way that we can deal with this service, but we don't have tiered services because we don't have the data to support segmenting students into tiers or groups or that thing.
Yeah, it's a fair point that you bring up. I think you have to start somewhere. You have to, and if ultimately if we don't have internal capacity built quite yet, then one of the things that I always question is, what do you have for tier 2 supports? Like, do you have group-based supports? Because that's going to build your capacity dramatically. Have you partnered with community-based mental health to ready up your response before you can build that internal capacity? So it's certainly a complex issue, Craig. I got to give it to you. But you can start. You can bring it to scale at a comfortable pace. But you have to be sensitive to the fact that the larger system built around screening has to be ready for this too. And that means that you need group-based therapeutic services and you need staff that are well-versed in evidence-based practice. So all good stuff. I appreciate that. This is what you can get to. 7-year anxiety trend data. We were doing really good before the pandemic. 8.5% decrease in moderate and severe symptom presentation, 11.5% increase in no concern. We loved that. And then the pandemic hit, sad times, reversed a lot of that data. But what I will orient you to is, well, look at this. We're starting in already on movement in the right direction on both ends of the continuum. Albeit we're going to need time to get there, but we're doubling down on what we did before. Early identification, proactive services and supports, evidence-based services. We know that's going to move the dial on these numbers. It already is. Same with depression. I'll let you take a look at these later. Same with post-traumatic stress, albeit we only started screening for trauma last year. All right, we got 15 minutes. This is going to be one of the most important parts of this presentation. I want to talk you through how to set yourself up for success with starting screening in a pilot fashion. CQI 101, we're going to talk about PDSA cycles. You're going to plan a small test of change. You're going to carry it out and collect some data. You're going to study those data such that you can understand the impact and the results of that test of change, and you're going to take action. Do I abandon this? Do I adapt it? Do I adopt it? The reason that we do this is so that we can capture the change over time and have a plan for how we're going to roll it out in a not haphazard way. It's an iterative cycle of change, an iterative process where we're going to ultimately take the scale of our implementation up over time and adjust our practice accordingly relative to that scale. Here's a PDSA worksheet that you can steal if you want to organize your work in that fashion. Why do we keep our tests small? Because the consequences of a failed test are rarely minor. We're talking about morale being crushed, resource utilization wasted, impact on our clients, on our kids. It's going to kill buy-in. I've heard horror stories about people going all in on screening too fast and they forgot to do something, so it goes sideways. And then people are like, ha, I told you screening doesn't work. It's a bad thing. And it's not that screening's bad. It's that the implementation plan wasn't well thought out to begin with. Does that make sense? This is the place to start, right? Keeping your first test of change small. I mentioned this earlier. I think I had the same exact slide earlier. You're going to learn an awful lot about screening by screening one kid, one day, one measure. This is a manageable first test of change. You're going to learn about all this stuff if you do it well. And you're going to avoid this. Your team decides to implement universal screening all at once. Tomorrow, you're going to screen 1,000 kids with the PHQ-9. You decide that you can put off that score interpretation and clinical interview training until after you screen. You're also going to put together a list of who will respond to the data after you get through screening. What's going to happen? What do you think? What are the potential implications of this? Come on, come off mute. I know you're still there. You're tired. It's the end of the day. Chaos, says Erin. A lot of kids will not get the support they need. Appreciate that, Pat.
Students who are at immediate risk aren't going to get help.
Good call, Madeline. It's dangerous, says Lauren. Agreed. This is a nightmare. This is bad times. Ethical landmine, yeah. Let's pretend you screen a kid with the PHQ-9 tomorrow and it goes miserably wrong. Like you score it wrong, you call the wrong parent afterwards. You're like, oh my God, like you're standing over the kid's shoulder during the screen in a really awkward way. It's just miserable. Okay, well, that's uncomfortable. That is unfortunate. That's not going to end your career. You screen 1,000 kids tomorrow with the PHQ-9 and you mess up, that's it. So bring it to scale at a pace that's okay. How about don't screen for suicide out the gate? Maybe like pick a measure that is a safer bet to start. We started with the GAD-7. Why? Not because we felt like anxiety was more important than depression, because the idea of talking about anxiety was more palatable for our population than the idea of depression and suicide. We got buy-in because we did it right with this measure that was safer, and then we had a very easy entry to scaling up screening with a different measure. Please start small. Start small. This does not have to be a race. Start small, but please do start. It's something that you have to practice. You're going to get good at this if you practice it. And in order to foster that practice, here is your challenge. I'm going to challenge all of you here. And here's the form that I'd like you to submit. If you're interested in being a part of this, you will be highlighted for all to see, your district, if you want. One student, one measure. Consider the use of recommended measures on the next page. I'll get to that. The identified kid that you use or that you're going to screen should already be enrolled in services. That means that you are not going to have a +1 with services after the screen. It should also be a family that adores you and it's going to be very comfortable with you doing whatever with their kid. I challenge you to take this action by March 15th. You can do this. You could do this tomorrow. First on the board is going to get a special call out. This is a safe practice if you use the right tools. This is a safe practice if you go at a speed that makes sense. Get active consent to start. Screen a kid that does not need to be screened because you know the outcome. Who here can commit to doing this? Who feels like they're going to take this on? What do you think? Heather's, yeah, Madeline's in, Jamie's in, Patrick's in. I like it. I'd ask all of you to consider whether or not this is feasible. I think it is. If you can do this, great. You will be one step closer to getting screening off the ground. Here are some recommended measures, easy to score. I've included the PHQ-9 on here. If you're already working with a student that presents with suicidal ideation and depression, you're already aware of the issues that you have to contend with. It is not going to be more work for you to administer this tool to that student. I would tend to say, here's a safe one that's easy to score. Quick, low temperature. You mess it up, it's not going to be the end of the world, but get practice. These are two sets of resources that I want to offer to you. I told you to get some free stuff. This is a resource guide that has a ton of stuff in it. I'm going to pull it up for you. I created this with the idea that you need practical stuff to get screening off the ground. We can do plenty of theory crafting, but let's get practical with screening. So we've got a sample parent guardian notification letter. We've got sample opt-out notification, procedural reminders for the screening team prior to screening, procedural guide, implementation calendars, some selected resources down here. You've got the implementation guide, which I'll show you next, screening playbook, shape system. I do want to show you these. These are shareable measures. Every single one of these is set up to auto score for you. So if you like the GAD-7, steal it. Watch the video so that you can learn how to link up the form and the scoring template, and you're done. I don't want you to have to take more than a couple minutes to get the tool readied up for you to use. Let's take the guesswork out of it. All of these measures are open source. They're free. You just need to match them up. There's also a slew of progress monitoring templates. If you feel like your entry point with screening is 1 or 2 kids at a time, just make copies of these. Let's take a look at the PHQ-9. If I make a copy of this for a kid, they type in the green boxes, it scores it for you, and then it produces a pretty run chart over time. It's really, really easy to use. Just steal it. There's also some PDSA stuff in here, follow-up guide. I do want to show you the implementation guide before we go. We got 7 minutes left for this. This is a guide that I developed that really walks you through each of those major components of screening. If you can answer these questions with your team, you're going to find the pinch points in your implementation, the gaps in the process. You're going to be able to use this kind of inquiry-based approach to get to a final plan. When you're done answering all the questions, you've got your plan for screening, and then you can organize your work at the end for screening day and follow-up. Let's just take the guesswork out of it. Okay. Some more resources. You're welcome to all of them. Please share seamlessly, steal shamelessly. That is our motto. Special message for Category A grant recipients. This is the stuff that you are going to be asked to collect. I'm going to be working with Shannon Lee to be able to put together the form that you will fill out to get this stuff. If you do the things we talked about today, one student, one measure, you will be able to report out on this stuff over time. We're going to have 4 workshop sessions coming up. I'll give you the dates for those grant recipients. Friends, Thriving Minds thanks you. If you want updates from Thriving Minds, then by all means, click on the link, sign up for our mailing list, and reach out anytime. I am so thrilled that you stuck around today and that you hung out with me and the rest of the team. I hope you got something out of this session. If you did, wonderful. This is a really, really important topic. And I really appreciate the fact that you've taken a Wednesday afternoon before break to talk about something that is incredibly important. The evaluations in the chat, really would appreciate your feedback. And thank you all for being here. I'm going to stick around for questions if anyone has them. But for those of you that want to get home and are hungry and tired, I totally get it. But I will stick around for you. Thank you very much for being here and for the work you do for our kids. I hope you have an awesome night.